Have you ever looked out at a crowded street in a major cosmopolitan city and just marveled at the sheer, breathtaking variety of human skin tones? It really is a beautiful, continuous gradient, ranging from the deepest, richest ebonies and dark chocolates, all the way to the palest, almost translucent porcelains. But if we were to somehow rewind the planetary clock, roughly 70,000 years, that spectacular rainbow simply wouldn't exist. If you could step into a time machine and stand on the sun-baked golden savannas of East Africa, looking at our absolute earliest Homo sapiens ancestors, you would see exactly one color palette. Every single one of us, regardless of where we live today, comes from a lineage that was brilliantly, beautifully, and functionally dark-skinned. This deep pigmentation wasn't just some random genetic roll of the dice. It was our very first evolutionary superpower. Dark skin, which is packed to the brim with a complex, incredibly efficient pigment called eumelanin, was our earliest and greatest armor. It acted as a built-in, biological sunscreen, protecting our ancestors' relatively hairless bodies from the relentless, blistering ultraviolet radiation pouring down from the equatorial sun. It physically stopped that harsh radiation from penetrating the blood vessels under the skin and destroying folate, a vital nutrient that is absolutely critical for healthy pregnancies and fetal development. Down in the heart of Africa, having highly melanized skin wasn't just an aesthetic trait. It was the ultimate, non-negotiable mechanism for human survival. But as we know all too well, humans are incredibly restless creatures. We simply refused to stay put. We started walking. And as we walked out of the African continent, slowly spreading our footprints across the uncharted globe, that universal armor began to encounter strange new environments, where the biological rules of survival were completely flipped upside down. Now, when this topic comes up, the question people usually ask is, why human skin color changed? And we generally know the basic high school biology class answer to that: vitamin D. Our bodies absolutely require ultraviolet sunlight to synthesize vitamin D in our skin, which is essential for building strong bones and maintaining a functioning immune system. Too much heavy melanin blocks that vital light. So the standard logic dictates that when humans moved to places with significantly less sunlight, they had to slowly lose the dark pigment to let the weak light in, or else they would suffer from crippling bone diseases like rickets. But today, we are going to look past the standard textbook answers and ask a much more fascinating question. We aren't just going to ask why. We are going to ask exactly where. Where on the physical, geographical map of the ancient world did this dramatic, visible transformation actually take place? If we could somehow track our ancestors' ancient footsteps with a modern GPS, where is the specific geographical line they crossed, where their deep brown skin finally started to fade into lighter and lighter shades? Was it a sudden, dramatic switch the very moment they stepped foot on the European continent? Did it happen while they were shivering in the freezing, wind-swept tundras of Ice Age Siberia? Or did it happen in a time and a place that is completely unexpected? To find out, we need to treat this like a global, prehistoric detective story. We have to follow the ancient migration routes out of the African motherland and trace them into the shifting, unfamiliar shadows of the global north. Picture the very first major exodus. Small, tight-knit bands of intrepid hunter-gatherers, moving carefully, step by step out of the Horn of Africa. They cross the shallow waters of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, or perhaps they migrate slowly up through the arid expanse of the Sinai Peninsula. Finally, they step into the Middle East, into the regions we now call the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula. At this exact point in the journey, you might logically think, okay, they have officially left Africa. The climate is changing, the sun feels a bit different. Surely this is where the great fading begins. But the geographical reality of our planet tells a completely different story. The Middle East, even tens of thousands of years ago during different climate cycles, was still completely bathed in intense direct sunlight for the vast majority of the year. The latitude here simply hadn't changed enough to trigger any kind of evolutionary panic. The UV radiation striking the rolling deserts of Arabia and the sparkling coasts of the Mediterranean Sea was still more than strong enough to easily penetrate highly melanized skin. It was producing all the vitamin D those early wandering travelers could ever possibly need. So, for thousands upon thousands of years, As our resilient ancestors wandered through the Levant, as they camped and hunted along the fertile riverbanks of ancient Mesopotamia, they kept their dark African skin. They absolutely didn't need to change. Their original biological armor was still working perfectly. But eventually, the map starts to tilt. The great human migration begins to splinter and branch out. Some groups keep walking east, relentlessly tracing the warm southern coastlines of Asia towards India, down through Southeast Asia, and eventually crossing the ocean to Australia. Because they are staying entirely within that sun-drenched tropical equatorial belt, their skin remains deeply pigmented. However, other brave groups turn their faces away from the equator and look north. They look toward the towering, imposing, snow-capped peaks of the Caucasus Mountains. They stare out at the vast, endless, grassy steppes of Central Asia, and slowly, cautiously, they begin to walk into the shadows. As they cross the 35th parallel north, which is roughly the same latitude as modern-day Tehran, or the very southern tip of Spain, the literal geometry of the Earth begins to actively work against them. Because our planet is a sphere tilted on its axis, the further north you travel, the more of a steep angle the sun's rays have to take to punch through the atmosphere. Up here, the Earth's atmosphere acts like a giant invisible sponge, aggressively soaking up those precious ultraviolet B rays long before they ever have a chance to hit the ground. By the time these ancient pioneers were pushing deep into the rugged valleys of the Caucasus and exploring the southern, icy edges of Ice Age Europe, they were entering a harsh, unforgiving world of long, dark winters and incredibly weak, angled sunlight. Their greatest evolutionary advantage, their dark, protective skin, was suddenly, terrifyingly, becoming their greatest biological liability. The melanin was simply doing its job too well. It was acting like a heavy lead shield, blocking the pathetic, weak northern sunlight from penetrating their skin, and their internal vitamin D production began to plummet dangerously. Now, you would probably think this is the exact spot on the map where the great fading occurred. You would naturally assume that the very moment they crossed those mountains into the European and Asian continents, evolution kicked into absolute overdrive, rapidly stripping away the melanin to save them from a catastrophic vitamin D deficiency. But the truth is, evolution is notoriously lazy, and it almost never takes the straightest, most obvious path. As these weary pioneers stepped into the freezing, cloudy, sun-starved north, they were about to discover a massive biological loophole, and they were about to meet someone who had already been living in the dark for a very, very long time. That someone wasn't just a passing stranger wandering the tundra. They were our long-lost, heavy-browed, incredibly resilient cousins, the Neanderthals. Imagine the cinematic scene of that very first encounter. A small band of our tall, slender, dark-skinned Homo sapiens ancestors is cresting a snowy, wind-blasted ridge somewhere in the jagged peaks of the Zagros Mountains, or perhaps looking out over a freezing, foggy valley in the vast Eurasian steppe. Peering through the mist, they see another group of humans huddled around a roaring fire. But these people look entirely different. They are noticeably shorter, incredibly barrel-chested to hold in body heat, equipped with prominent brow ridges, and crucially, their skin is pale, maybe even peppered with distinct freckles, and topped with thick, fiery red hair. The Neanderthals hadn't just arrived in this frozen wasteland. They practically owned the place. For upwards of 300,000 years, while our direct ancestors were baking under the intense, glorious equatorial sun of Africa, Neanderthals had been enduring the brutal, sun-starved, unforgiving ice ages of Europe and Western Asia. Over those hundreds of millennia, the slow, grinding engine of evolution had already done its work on them. Modern genetic sequencing of ancient Neanderthal bone fragments has revealed a fascinating truth. They possessed specific mutations in genes like MC1R, which is a major director of skin and hair pigmentation. They had already figured out exactly how to survive in this dim, low UV environment by significantly dialing back the melanin in their skin, allowing their bodies to act like giant biological sponges for whatever weak sunlight they could catch. So, here is where our prehistoric detective story gets really, really spicy. When these two very different human species bumped into each other in the shadows of the north, they didn't just wave politely and walk past. They mingled, They shared campsites, they likely shared hunting strategies, and they absolutely, undeniably shared genetics. Today, almost every single person on Earth, with non-African ancestry, carries about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. It is a literal, microscopic ghost living permanently inside our modern genome. Now, put your evolutionary biologist hat on for just a second. You are a population of dark-skinned humans moving into a freezing, dark environment where your heavy melanin is actively blocking the tiny bit of vitamin D you desperately need to survive. You interbreed with a local, well-established population that already possesses the perfect genetic cheat code for pale skin, beautifully adapted to that exact latitude. Logically, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? The offspring who inherit those pale skin genes are going to thrive. They will avoid deadly bone diseases, and they will rapidly pass those traits on to the next generation. It is the ultimate evolutionary shortcut. Why wait thousands of years for a random lucky mutation to save your life, when you can just genetically copy-paste the solution from the locals? For a while, this was a heavily favored hypothesis in the scientific community. We didn't slowly evolve light skin, we essentially just stole the sunscreen formula from the Neanderthals. It's a brilliantly simple, perfectly elegant scientific story. There is just one tiny, immensely frustrating problem with it. It is completely, 100% wrong. Science has a very funny habit of ruining perfectly clean narratives. When modern geneticists finally unlocked the fragile secrets of ancient DNA and compared the specific genes that cause light skin in modern Europeans and Asians with the genetic codes found in Neanderthal remains, they were absolutely stunned. The puzzle pieces emphatically did not fit together. The genetic mutations that gave Neanderthals their pale skin are completely biologically different from the mutations that give modern people their light skin today. Think of it like two different software engineers trying to fix the exact same critical bug in a computer program, but writing completely different lines of code to get the job done. The Neanderthals had their own unique biological software for surviving the Dark North, and when they eventually went tragically extinct around 40,000 years ago, their specific brand of pale skin went extinct right along with them. We didn't steal their genetic homework. We didn't inherit their built-in winter survival gear. Whatever genetic swaps happened around those ancient, icy campfires, the trait for pale skin somehow got lost in the shuffle, or it just wasn't the specific trait that ended up surviving the brutal evolutionary filter of our lineage. This revelation is a massive plot twist for our map. It means that as our Homo sapiens ancestors pushed deeper and deeper into the freezing, cloudy, forested depths of the European continent, officially claiming the frozen north for themselves, they were completely on their own. They were facing a severe, existential crisis. Without enough UV light, their vitamin D levels should have plummeted, causing rickets, leading to dangerously deformed pelvises in women, making childbirth fatal, and ultimately dooming the population. Evolutionary pressure should have been screaming at their DNA to drop the melanin immediately, or face total extinction. Yet, they didn't go extinct. They survived. They hunted massive woolly mammoths across the ice, and they painted breathtaking, vibrant masterpieces in the deep caves of France and Spain, all while wearing the exact same dark skin they had brought from Africa. If the weak northern sun wasn't giving them what they needed to survive, where on earth were they getting their lifeline? The answer to that life or death question remained buried in the dirt for tens of thousands of years, completely invisible to the naked eye. For the longest time, historians and anthropologists just naturally assumed that the transition from dark to pale skin happened almost immediately as soon as our ancestors set up camp in Europe. It just made logical sense, right? You move into the freezing, cloudy north, you lose the melanin, boom, problem solved. But within the last decade, the rapidly advancing field of ancient DNA sequencing shattered that assumption entirely, delivering one of the most stunning plot twists in the history of human evolution. To really grasp just how wrong our assumptions were, I want you to picture a scene in the damp, winding cave systems of the Cantabrian Mountains in northwestern Spain. The year is 2006. Explorers deep inside a cave called La Braña stumble upon the skeletal remains of two ancient men. These weren't Neanderthals. These were fully modern humans, hunter-gatherers who had lived, hunted, and died roughly 7,000 years ago. Now, 7,000 years ago might sound like a long time, but in evolutionary terms, it's barely a blink. These men were living in Europe thousands of years after the Great Ice Age glaciers had started to retreat. By all conventional logic, they had been living in this dim, northern environment more than long enough for evolution to have completely bleached their skin. When geneticists carefully extracted the incredibly fragile DNA from the teeth of one of these skeletons, a man now famously known to science as Lebrania-1, they ran it through the sequencer fully expecting to find the standard genetic markers for pale European skin. Instead, the computer spit out a genetic profile that left them completely speechless. Lebrania-1 carried the exact same ancestral African versions of the pigmentation genes as the original humans who first walked out of the savannah. Despite living in the foggy, sun-starved mountains of northern Spain, this man had deeply pigmented, very dark skin. And he wasn't an isolated anomaly. A few years later, scientists performed the exact same genetic magic trick on Britain's oldest complete skeleton, the famous Cheddar Man, who lived roughly around the same time, about 10,000 years ago. Cheddar Man was found in a limestone cave in Somerset, England, a place not exactly famous for its blistering year-round sunshine. Yet, his DNA told the exact same shocking story. He had very dark brown, perhaps even nearly black skin, accompanied by dark, curly hair. But here is where the genetics throw a wild, beautiful curveball into the mix. While these ancient European hunter-gatherers retained their dark skin, evolution had tinkered with something else. Both Lebrania-1 and Cheddar Man possessed the genetic mutation for brilliantly bright, piercing blue eyes. Try to visualize that for a second. An entire continent populated by rugged, dark-skinned, dark-haired hunter-gatherers staring out at the icy tundra with striking, crystal blue eyes. It's an aesthetic combination that is incredibly rare today, but for tens of thousands of years, it was the absolute standard look of the ancient European. So, we are back to our massive, glaring biological paradox. These ancient people were living in deep, dark, ancient forests under gloomy, overcast skies at extremely high latitudes. Their dark skin was actively blocking what little ultraviolet light managed to punch through the clouds. They were biologically primed to suffer from massive, catastrophic vitamin D deficiencies. Their bones should have been brittle, their immune systems should have collapsed, and they should have faded into the evolutionary dustbin. How on earth did they survive, let alone thrive, for over 30,000 years in Europe, without changing their skin color? The secret to their survival wasn't written in their skin. It was on their dinner plates. Evolution, as we've established, is incredibly practical. It doesn't fix a problem if it doesn't have to. And these ancient hunter-gatherers had unknowingly stumbled upon a massive geographical loophole that completely bypassed the need for sunlight. You see, ultraviolet rays aren't the only way for the human body to get vitamin D. You can also ingest it directly, and the diet of these prehistoric Europeans was an absolute unfiltered vitamin D powerhouse. Think about what a hunter-gatherer living in Ice Age Europe was actually eating on a daily basis. They weren't munching on salads and grains. They were tracking massive game across the steppes. They were eating highly nutritious organ meats, specifically the liver, which is essentially a natural biological storage tank for massive amounts of vitamin D. But even more importantly, as they followed the winding rivers and settled along the rugged coastlines of places like ancient Britain and Scandinavia, they became master fishermen. They pulled massive amounts of oily, fatty fish from the freezing waters. They hunted seals, walruses, and other marine mammals, blubber-rich in nutrients. By constantly gorging themselves on this incredibly rich, carnivorous, marine-heavy diet, these ancient Europeans were basically swallowing fistfuls of prehistoric vitamin D supplements every single day. Their bodies simply didn't care that the northern sun was weak, or that their heavy melanin was blocking the UV rays. Their blood was already saturated with all the vitamin D they could ever possibly need, entirely courtesy of their diet. Because the biological crisis was completely averted by what they were eating, the evolutionary pressure to lose their protective dark skin completely vanished. It was turned off. So they kept it. For thousands and thousands of years, generation after generation, the ancient European hunter-gatherer remained beautifully, functionally dark-skinned. But as we all know, nothing in human history stays the same forever. If the native Europeans were dark-skinned just 7,000 years ago, where exactly did the pale skin we associate with modern Europe actually come from? If the freezing climate and the weak northern sun weren't enough to trigger the change, what was? To find the exact geographical coordinate where human skin finally, dramatically began to lose its color, we have to look away from the freezing European coastlines and turn our eyes toward the east, toward the fertile, sun-baked valleys of the ancient Near East, where a radical new technology was about to completely break the dietary loophole forever. That radical new technology was agriculture. We need to rewind the evolutionary clock just a little bit and shift our geographical map specifically to the region of Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and the wider Fertile Crescent. Around 10 to 12,000 years ago, humanity pulled off the absolute greatest magic trick in our entire history. We finally stopped wandering, and we started planting. We domesticated wild, unruly grasses into dependable crops like wheat and barley. We started keeping docile animals in wooden pens instead of chasing dangerous, unpredictable beasts across the freezing ice. It was the absolute dawn of the agricultural revolution, and in terms of sheer caloric output and raw population growth, it was an incredibly resounding triumph. Humans could finally build permanent, stable villages, stockpile massive surpluses of food for the winter, and watch their populations absolutely explode across the landscape. But from a purely biological and nutritional standpoint, this shiny new sedentary lifestyle was a massive, entirely unforeseen downgrade. Think about what a prehistoric bowl of primitive wheat porridge actually contains. It is packed to the brim with glorious, life-sustaining carbohydrates, which is utterly fantastic for keeping you from starving to death when the snow falls. But do you know what it completely lacks? Vitamin D. Cereal grains have essentially zero vitamin D. By eagerly abandoning the grueling hunter-gatherer lifestyle, these early farmers completely walked away from the rich, oily fish and the incredibly dense organ meats that had kept their European ancestors biologically afloat in the dark. They unknowingly traded their prehistoric vitamin supplements for daily rations of bread. Now, as long as these early farmers stayed tightly clustered in the sun-drenched valleys of the Near East and the sparkling Mediterranean coast, this massive dietary shift didn't really matter. The sun continuously beating down on Anatolia and the Levant was still more than intense enough to easily penetrate their moderately dark skin and manufacture all the vitamin D their growing bodies could ever possibly need. The scorching southern sun was doing all the heavy lifting, completely masking the fact that their new, modern diet was dangerously deficient. But successful farmers desperately need space. As their populations rapidly boomed, they quickly ran out of fertile, arable land. So, they started to aggressively pack up their seeds and look for new horizons. Around 8,000 years ago, massive, sweeping waves of these early Anatolian farmers crossed the Bosporus Strait and began a relentless, unstoppable march northwest, pushing deep into the absolute heart of the European continent. Without realizing it, they were walking straight into the shadows. And this is the exact moment, the precise historical and geographical intersection where the evolutionary trap finally, violently snapped shut. Picture the absolute biological disaster that was unfolding. You now have massive, growing populations of people migrating directly into the gloomy, cloud-covered, high-latitude forests of Central and Northern Europe. The sunlight here is incredibly weak, blocked by dense tree canopies, and strikes the earth at a steep, pathetic angle for more than half the year. Their skin is still relatively dark, aggressively acting like a shield and blocking those desperately needed ultraviolet rays. And crucially, the ancient, life-saving dietary loophole is entirely gone. They aren't eating seal blubber or mammoth liver anymore. They are eating gruel, bread, and grains day after day. The biological safety net has been completely, permanently ripped away. This wasn't just a minor health inconvenience. It was a total evolutionary catastrophe. Without adequate vitamin D, the human body simply cannot absorb calcium. And without calcium, the human skeleton literally begins to fail from the inside out. Children growing up in these dark, damp, early farming settlements developed severe, crippling rickets. Their bones remained soft and pliable, their legs bowing outward under the mere weight of their own growing bodies. But the absolute most brutal, unforgiving filter of this crisis fell squarely on the women. Severe vitamin D deficiency causes the bones of the pelvis to warp and dramatically deform. In an era thousands of years before the invention of modern medicine or cesarean sections, a deformed pelvis made childbirth an agonizing, inescapable death sentence for both the young mother and the baby. The evolutionary pressure had never been louder. It was a literal biological mandate. You must adapt to the dark, or you will go entirely extinct. The ultimate salvation of these migrating farmers came down to a tiny, almost microscopic typo in their DNA. Sometime earlier, a totally random genetic mutation had appeared in a specific gene called SLC24A5. Now, you don't need to memorize the scientific name, just know that this specific gene acts as the master switch for human melanin production. This tiny, seemingly insignificant mutation effectively jammed the switch in the off position. It aggressively dialed back the body's production of dark pigment, leaving the skin incredibly pale, almost translucent. Back in the sunny, radiant Middle East, this genetic mutation was just a harmless, random quirk that didn't provide much of an advantage. But the very moment these pioneer farmers brought that specific gene into the dark, sun-starved forests of ancient Europe, it instantly became a biological superpower. Pale skin miraculously turned the human body into a desperate, highly efficient solar panel. It allowed the weak, angled, miserable northern sunlight to instantly penetrate the skin and kickstart massive vitamin D production, completely saving them from the catastrophic, deadly effects of their new grain-based diet. What happened next was one of the fastest, most violent genetic sweeps in the entire recorded history of human evolution. It absolutely wasn't a slow, gentle fading over millions of years. It was an explosive, brutal, life-or-death genetic selection. If you carried the light skin mutation, your bones grew straight, you survived childbirth, and you successfully passed the gene to your children. If you didn't, your bloodline tragically ended in the dirt. As these pale-skinned farmers swept across Europe, replacing the dark-skinned hunter-gatherers, they permanently painted the continent with the pale skin we recognize today. So the Great European Fading wasn't caused just by the cold. It was triggered by a prehistoric bowl of porridge. But Europe is only one part of the map. As this happened in the West, what was happening to the humans who walked toward the freezing extremes of the Far East? While the dramatic, life-or-death saga of the early European farmers was unfolding in the West, a completely separate, equally spectacular evolutionary drama was playing out on the exact opposite side of the Eurasian continent. If we drag our prehistoric map all the way over to the sprawling, towering mountain ranges and the endless, wind-swept plains of East Asia, we find another branch of the human family tree facing the exact same geographical nightmare. These ancient populations had walked a completely different path out of Africa. They had navigated the treacherous, towering peaks of the Himalayas, crossed the harsh expanse of the Gobi Desert, and pushed relentlessly north into the freezing, punishing extremes of Ice Age Siberia and northern China. Just like their distant cousins in Europe, they had crossed the critical geographic threshold. They were living far above the equator, trapped under weak, angled northern sunlight. And just like the ancient Europeans, for tens of thousands of years, they likely utilized the exact same dietary loophole. As long as these eastern hunter-gatherers were pulling massive fish from the freezing coastal waters of the Pacific, or hunting massive, fat-rich game across the snowy Siberian tundra, their heavy melanin wasn't a problem. Their carnivorous diet was keeping their vitamin D levels perfectly afloat, completely bypassing the need for a genetic mutation. But the agricultural revolution wasn't just a European phenomenon. Thousands of miles away, completely isolated from the wheat fields of Anatolia, ancient people in the Yellow River and Yangtze River valleys were undergoing their own massive agricultural awakening. They were domesticating entirely different plants, specifically wild millet and rice. Yet, the biological consequences were exactly the same. As these ancient Asian populations transitioned from a nomadic, meat-heavy hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a stationary, grain-based agricultural existence, their dietary vitamin D plummeted. The safety net was gone. As these booming farming populations migrated further north into the darker, colder regions of East Asia, the evolutionary trap snapped shut on them too. They desperately needed pale skin to absorb the weak northern sunlight, or their bones would fail. But here is the most fascinating part of the entire story. They were completely, physically cut off from the genetic pool of Europe. They didn't have access to that magical genetic mutation that had saved the European farmers. They had to find their own way out of the dark. Evolution, in its infinite brilliance, found a completely different genetic solution to the exact same geographical problem. It is a phenomenon biologists call convergent evolution. Imagine two brilliant students taking the exact same incredibly difficult math test in entirely different rooms. They both arrive at the exact same correct answer, but when you look at their scratch paper, they used completely different formulas and showed entirely different work to get there. Instead of relying on the European genetic switch, the ancestors of modern East Asians developed mutations in entirely different parts of their DNA. Genes with names like OCA2 and others were subtly tweaked and modified by the intense pressure of survival. These unique mutations effectively reduced the melanin in their skin, achieving the exact same pale, sunlight-absorbing result as the Europeans, but using a completely different biological blueprint. This is why the pale skin of someone from Scotland and the pale skin of someone from northern Japan, while functionally doing the exact same job of catching ultraviolet light, often have slightly different aesthetic qualities and tanning behaviors. They are literally running on different biological operating systems, beautifully coded by the specific, isolated environments of their ancestors. It proves that light skin isn't some singular ancient trait that appeared once and was handed out to the rest of the world. It is a highly specific, desperate survival tool that human biology independently invented multiple times in entirely different locations, whenever the geographical location and the human diet demanded it. Today, we live in a completely unprecedented era. Because of modern technology, airplanes, and globalized cities, we have completely shattered the ancient geographical map. People with deeply melanized skin, perfectly adapted for the equatorial sun, now live in cloudy northern cities like London or Seattle, often requiring daily vitamin D supplements just to stay healthy. Conversely, people with incredibly pale skin, built specifically for the freezing, sun-starved shadows of the Ice Age, now live in blistering, sun-drenched places like Australia or Texas, desperately slathering on chemical sunscreens to prevent their skin from literally burning up. We have completely scrambled the evolutionary board in the blink of an eye. So, when you look at that crowded city street we talked about at the very beginning, and you see that breathtaking, continuous rainbow of human skin tones, you aren't just looking at random colors. You are looking at a living, breathing map of human endurance. Skin color isn't a measure of humanity, intelligence, or worth. It is simply a geographical sunburn receipt. It is a beautiful, microscopic record of exactly where your specific ancestors happened to be standing when the climate changed, when the sun faded, and when they had to adapt, against all odds, just to keep the human story going. Thank you so much for exploring the deep, fascinating history of our ancient ancestors with me today. If you enjoyed this journey across the prehistoric map, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments below, what ancient human mystery should we unravel next? Until then, keep wondering, keep wandering, and I will see you in the next one.